Hello, I'm Rob Higurita, Technical Account Manager with AWS Enterprise Support, located in Austin, Texas. Welcome to AWS Knowledge Center Live, where we share AWS best practices and troubleshooting tips from AWS support. Today, we're going to be talking about AWS Elastic Cloud Compute spot instances with autoscaling. And joining me today is Michael Beck. Michael, please introduce yourself.
Hey, thanks, Rob. So I'm Michael Beck, and I've been with AWS for a couple of years, and I'm an enterprise support manager in San Francisco, California. Glad to be here with you today. And I will be stepping in to moderate.
Great, thanks, Michael, for joining us today. And thanks, everyone else, for joining on our show today. Please make sure to leverage the chat and ask your questions. And I guess without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started on our discussion here about our leveraging Amazon EC2 spot compute with autoscaling. So if you haven't Amazon Cloud Compute and spot instances and autoscaling, we hope today you're able to kind of leave learning a little bit more about it and how you can use it with your infrastructure. So if you're familiar with Elastic Cloud Compute or not, we have a few different options that you can use. We have on-demand instances, and those are kind of if you just go in and start using the AWS console, you might just spin up an EC2 instance and launch it as on-demand. This is just pay for compute capacity by the second. There's no long-term commitments to it, so you can start an instance, you can stop an instance anytime and just pay for what you've used for that instance. It's great for spiky workloads that kind of, as you're getting started using it, you haven't defined what you're really going to use in instances for Elastic Cloud Compute. You can use on-demand to kind of get started. Second, we have our reserved instance and saving plan. These are really just cost-saving constructs that we have to go with on-demand instances. So once you've worked out kind of your workload and how you're going to leverage our Elastic Cloud Compute instances, you can then basically make a commitment to that and leverage it to save money. So with a reserved instance or savings plan, you basically say, I'm going to use so much compute, and based on that, we in turn will give you a discount. And it's really great for steady state workloads. So you've got your production or workloads that you know are going to stay very steady. You can make that kind of commitment and get that cost savings on it. What we're going to spend a lot of time talking today is really on spot instances. And this is spare EC2 capacity at a savings up to 90% off on-demand prices. It's great. It's available for fault-tolerant, flexible, stateless workloads that allows you to take advantage of basically unused on-demand capacity at a cost savings. Do you have any questions, I guess, Michael, before we go forward from these different options here on the cost options?
Yeah, Alex just had asked us, Alex Smasha is asking that this is excess capacity, and I know you're going to be touching on that in a moment a little bit more. So yeah, feel free to carry on.
All right, great. Yes, no, we're definitely going to, as well as just some kind of different use cases and such, building on. We're discussing about the three different options. So mentioned our on-demand, Spot has a really great cost-saving mechanism to it, but also we have these other options. So we kind of layer these different things together in order to really make sure that you can optimize your cost. Low cost is something that we always strive for. Doing cost reductions is one of our things, but also just we want to make sure you can do and build what you need. So as mentioned before, we have RIs or savings plans. Those are great for your known steady state workloads. You have on-demand that you can leverage as well. And this is for new workloads that you're building. Kind of steady, spiky workloads before you kind of define what's going to be long-lived inside of your account. Probably not where you want to stay if you have a production environment that you're going to be running, all year or every year at that certain size, because you're paying the most for it, and so that's why we have RIs and savings plans. And then on top of that, building on top of your cost savings for your one level of RIs and savings plans, and then your spiky usage, you can also leverage Spot. And that's where you just kind of further iterate, a little bit more of just making sure that you use all three of these in your environment, really to realize as much savings as you can throughout development. So, as mentioned before, we're going to talk about the capacity, right? So, yes, Spot is essentially excess capacity that we have that's unused on-demand capacity. Spot capacity pools, we're going to specifically cover a lot because we're going to go over kind of a capacity optimized usage for autoscaling and Spot. And as we can see here, we've got two different availability zones within AWS in this region. This one looking at North Virginia, and we have US East 1A and US East 1B. Now, these have two different spot capacity pools for each different type of instance because they're essentially two different physical locations. So we have M4 large that exists in US East 1A and M4 large that exists in US East 1B. These are two different capacity pools and two different sets of instances. Same goes for R's, the C4, and such. So as we can see here, we have some capacity pools and we have various types of instances that are in use. So we have, a majority of the M4 large in use, some R4 large in use, some C4 in US East 1A. We look at US East 1B and we've got far more capacity in use there for M4 larges, R4s, and C4s. But these are treated as two separate capacity pools, and that's, like I mentioned, we're going to cover how you can take advantage of that using auto scaling in this capacity optimized configuration. With that, it's going to allow you to really take advantage of each region's availability zone and instance type as independent spot pools, so that you're all really able to mix different instance families to be able to get that spot capacity without having to always constantly go through and manage it yourself. So you're not sitting there looking to see what capacity looks like here and trying to spread it out manually for yourself. With our auto scaling groups, we're able to really help you leverage a lot of that and manage a lot of it built in there. So does that help, I guess, kind of answer your question out from before? Just want to make sure we've got everything kind of clear here.
Yeah, we don't have a follow-up there, but hopefully that answered the question. If not, oh yes, we have a yes, sir.
Great, perfect. So yeah, we'll go ahead and continue on then, and we'll look at a couple different things that we did to additionally, so make this hopefully a little bit easier for our end users to leverage the service. So early on, we came out with some of the different auto scaling and using spot and on-demand and combination of things. You had to manage these individually. So with your auto scaling groups, you needed to have a combination of instance types and purchase options, but you had to do those in management of different things. So you had to have one auto scaling group that, say, managed your M4 large spot capacity that you wanted to leverage. You had to have another auto scaling group for M5 large spot as well. And then say you always wanted to have on-demand instances, so you had to have yet another auto-scaling group for C4 large on-demand instances. And while this still gave you the availability to mix things across different availability zones, it just took a little bit more time for you to set up multiple auto-scaling groups in order to have this kind of configuration and setup. So what we did is we made it easier by listening to our customers and saying, they wanted to be able to kind of mix this capacity and be able to use the services this way. And now we can have a single auto-scaling group that combines purchase options and instance types all in a single auto-scaling group. So as you can see here, we still have our multiple availability zones where we've got availability zone 1, availability zone 2, and availability zone 3. And we've got our different instances where we've got an M4 large spot and an M5 large spot and a C4 large on-demand, just like we had before. But instead of having to manage 3 individual auto-scaling groups, now we can configure this all into one. And so that's what we're going to take a look at today, really just demoing how to set that up and how to choose kind of your capacity optimization. So I'll pause there real quick just to see if there's any questions or anything else before we kind of jump into our demo of kind of how to set this up for you all. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen for a second.
Thanks, Rob. Also want to call out to everybody watching. Feel free to drop any other questions or comments you've got into the chat. I'll be happy to either respond there or I'll bring them up to Rob as he's going through and doing his demo or throughout the rest of the show.
Great. All right, so I'm going to share my screen here, and we're going to show just a little web app that we have set up that's leveraging an auto-scaling group and using our Elastic Cloud Compute and auto-scaling as well. So we'll also show how to tie this into Elastic Load Balancing really quickly towards the end, and a little bit of additional information on what we have configured. So When I was first setting up a lot of these things, I would set up primarily as an individual instance. As we can see here, this knowledge center live on demand with no auto scaling is just kind of what I tag the name of the instance. You can see here that it's got kind of a life cycle as normal. And this life cycle of normal essentially just means that it's an on-demand instance. It's not running under anything specific. So this is great if you're kind of testing out things or you're working on your environment. But if something were to happen with that single instance or it, you interrupt into your web services, right? And your application may not be available for end users to view. Of course, and so we leverage auto scaling to help alleviate that, giving us multiple instances to use. So we have these 3 instances, and we have them. I just have them tagged as Knowledge Center Live auto scaling instances, and there's 3 of them here. Depending on your workload, you may only need 2 of them. I, for demo purposes, just kind of set up so we have kind of a nice, highly available configuration. With these, I have a single one that has demand, and I have 2 that are set up as spot. So that's what we're really going to do today, is kind of how we get it to be deployed for us with a single on-demand and full spot instances to back that kind of additional workload. So this is a great setup for if you were to lose a single one of these instances. You wouldn't necessarily have to worry about losing one of them because you'd have 2 others to continue to serve your web traffic for you. And keep your application nice and highly available, while also saving you some costs by leveraging Spot instead of having to have on-demand instances that you're paying, the on-demand pricing for. So here we're going to take a quick look at launch configurations. I'm just going to back you to the main screen here so we can see. We've got 2 different options in order to leverage and do configurations with auto scaling. One of them is going to be launch configurations, and the other one's going to be our launch templates. I'm going to show you launch configuration really quickly here, how we can do some of the different setup. I'm going to spend a little more time in launch templates. So here we can choose a few different options. Give it a name, AMI or AMI. You can choose instance types. And then we can also additionally choose things like, request spot instances. With our launch configuration, you had to kind of specify overall what the cost was that you wanted to get that current price of things. And you can do other configurations like instance profile and such. Very similar to what we can do in our template. Let's go over, let me just get the launch templates open really quickly. And we're going to take a look there at kind of the difference here. So configuration is kind of the first iteration. And launch templates, we have kind of some nice additional features that we added. So with launch configurations, you had to basically define everything. And once you had everything defined, you had to go through and make an actual copy of that configuration to make changes to it, rather than just, say, editing the existing configuration or modifying the version of it. With launch templates, we can see here that we have this launch template, and we've got kind of a launch template name to go with it. And then we've also got the default version over here. Default version, along with we can really have multiple to a template without having to, say, copy a template and modify it and have a second template. We can just leverage the different versions. So let's take a look in here. And we've got kind of the launch template information, right? So we've got this abbreviated Knowledge Center Live auto scaling group launch template. Our default version is version 2. Like I mentioned before, you can have different versions to your template. So you can also set which one's actually your default. And this will helpful when we're actually using our auto scaling group, because rather than having to, say, change what launch configuration it's using, you can just simply change the template version. And that will help to make it a little bit easier to manage for the long run. So same things that we saw in our launch configuration, where we can specify our AMI or AMI, depending on how you like to say that. And then we can specify things like instance type, availability zones, keywords, what security groups we want to use with it, and some other information as well. This, though, is what we're going to kind of specify on. We don't have spec for instance type, and that's primarily because we're going to let our handle a lot of the instance type information, leveraging our capacity optimized kind of configuration. So from this, we have some options here, right, to right and click and create an scaling group. You could go to the section over there if you wanted to, but it's a nice easy drop down that you use if you have a template. And when you do that, the nice thing is you just give it a name, give your auto-scaling group a name. And this is walking through, essentially, we're going to show how to create that auto-scaling group that'll use that template. And since we did a launch auto-scaling group from that template, it's already kind of pre-filled that information for us. As you can see, we've got the same template listed here, the same AMI that we're going to use, security group, and really nothing else configured because we want our auto-scaling group to do a lot of the selection for us. And here's where we're going to configure our settings. And this gets into the point where we've got the different things for the combined purchase options and instance types that we're specifically looking at doing for these. Before we get going too much further into this launch configuration and launch template, I just want to check to see if there's any questions at all, Michael, about the variations in launch configurations to launch templates before we get a little bit further into this.
Hey, Rob. Yeah, we don't have any questions specifically around those. Do you have a preference, or do you see a benefit of using, say, one or the other in one situation or another?
So personally, I like the launch templates, mostly because of the iteration of versions. I think they're easier to manage myself as an end user, because I can just modify the existing template versions rather than having to copy or keep track of which one I copied from. So me personally, I like to use the launch templates. It also gives me the availability just to use a little bit more features that are currently existent in launch templates over the launch configurations.
All right, and then I think you just commented on that, but Alex Masha asks if you can apply this template. So we're talking about launch templates cross-region.
Oh, I actually have not tried that myself, but it's definitely, if you want to shoot us an email at the end of the episode, we can definitely get back to you on that. And I'll give the email address a little bit later on in the episode for what we can use. Lots of feedback there. Thanks.
All right, thanks.
Great. Okay, so we're going to continue on just a little bit on these different purchase options and instance types here that we're looking at. So basically, we have option here by on-demand and spot capacity launch, and then we have these multiple instance types we can use, right? So we have these different things here, and if we specify it in the launch template, we would have the option to adhere to the launch template. Since we didn't specify any instance types or anything in our template, we have this grayed out because there's nothing to adhere to there. So because we're going to take advantage of this capacity optimized kind of workload and such, we have these different combined instance purchases that we can do. And we have these settings here for optional on-demand base and then on-demand percentage above base. So for most of my customers and for myself, when I do these auto-scaling, I define usually just on-demand instance. And that's just kind of a base to start off. It's going to be kind of your steady, always kind of there for you. And then beyond that, we can do some additional things. Specify one on-demand instance. And then beyond that, I want to leverage everything to be spot because I don't need to pay for on-demand. Beyond that, I'm just going to leverage everything in spot. So I can set my allocation to 0% on-demand and 100% spot beyond that. So that means that we're going to have one on-demand instance that automatically starts with this auto-scaling group, and then defined later on by either how much we increase traffic or we have set for our different settings that we're going to set here in a second, how many additional instances we have running that are also spot and such. So here percent, we're going to leave this capacity optimized, and this is going to launch spot instances optimally based on available spot capacity, right? So this is designed to basically help you not have interruptions by allowing you to leverage a vast range of different kind of instance families and classes across the availability zones. So as we kind of looked at earlier, we saw that we have these different pools for each availability zone across, T3, C4s, R5s that we can leverage. And so this is going to help us do this. You can see we also have the option for lowest price. So if cost is your main concern, you can launch instances from the lowest price instance pools. And that's going to be basically just to help you drive down the actual cost of things even more so by only leveraging really what's inexpensive kind of out there for spot capacity. So these are kind of our different options that we have for those two. And then down here is going to be where you're going to kind of choose your instance types and instance families that you want to follow along with. So this is going to depend on kind of your workload and kind of see, what you need. This application that we're going to be leveraging today is fairly low overhead, doesn't take a ton of CPU, is a great workload fit for our T3 instances. So I'm just going to choose a T3 to start with. And we see, based on me selecting a T Nano, that it has made suggestions for me on other instance types that I should diversify across and basically leverage based on size and cost and basically availability here. So we can see I have some T3 large, T3 medium, T3 small, Pro, idea of going into these different ones. And additionally, I can manually choose and specify, say, to add some T2s. Not only to stay in the T3 family, but to go into T2 as well. Choose different ones based on saying I know that I also want to throw these will work fine for my application does. You can see over on the side these arrows up and downs and the X's, and we can use these to remove one. So if we didn't want to even pay for, say, a T3A large, we could remove that from our selection. We can weight these differently. So if we want to say, make sure that we leverage the smallest instances first and say, instead of a T3A or T3 large being our next, we could bump up the T3A small and micros into this to kind of weight those accordingly to get the lower cost options as well as take advantage of these different tools and such across. So, any questions there, Michael, at all about kind of selecting the different instance families?
Yeah, Rob, what I'd like to ask about, you mentioned earlier when you were talking about the old way of doing it, of specifying by family, by AZ, and that now you can do that. And here you're just showing T family. Are you able to mix and match? Is this available for other instance types like C or M or R or anything like that?
Yes, absolutely. So that's one of the great things, right? So this just made some automatic suggestions for me based on what I put in for my base kind of choice of a T3. But if I knew that my application also worked well with, say, C4s or C3s or whatever other instance family you wanted to choose and kind of test it against, then you could definitely leverage those in this as well and just specify like add instance type and do a C3 large and say that works for me. One thing you do want to make sure is, depending on your application and what you're kind of using it for, in this instance, it's a basic web application, so we don't have any timing consistency, things that we need to make sure work across processor families and such. But if you were going to say diversify T3s and T3As and your application was very specific to CPU architecture timing, you may want to test that just to kind of validate and make sure that you're going to get the same results from A instances versus the non-A instances, so the Intel versus AMD side of things. But if you're using a basic web application like this, I could absolutely just throw in some different R's, M's, whatever fit my overall usage.
All right, thanks.
Yeah. So we've covered kind of the different families and how we can kind of in here, how we can do some different weights and to adjust those accordingly. So we maybe use these T2 nanos and micros ahead. Additionally, in our auto scaling group, we need to configure things like where we want to be able to deploy them. So I'm just going to choose some different subnets that I have defined in my VPC. So you have to have your VPC set up right with these instances ready to be used in. So here I just selected 5 of the available subnets that I have created. And that just means that when my auto scaling group deploys these, it can basically leverage the spot capacity pools in those different availability zones. So I can use US East 1As, 1Bs, Cs, Ds, and Fs for those different instance types and such. So the more subnets you can kind of leverage across, the more capacity pools, right, you're going to be able to use and define with. All right. Here's where we would look at if we were going to tie in, say we had an application load balancer or a network load balancer available to use. We could select this and say enable load balancing and tie it to a target group. We're going to look a little bit at how you would integrate this just a little bit later in this demo. So we're just going to kind of move forward on this section. That's where we kind of track that. We can do health checks, right? So we can make sure that the instances are healthy. And this is going to help us in defining whether we're going to scale up a new instance based on these. For my application, it's just a basic Apache, so I don't need 5 minutes for it. So I'm going to bump my warm-up time down a little bit on this auto-scaling group. And then here's where we could leverage some additional settings, like enable monitoring, so we get some CloudWatch metrics and stuff. I recommend enabling this typically just because that way you get the extra additional information into CloudWatch. Of course, you have to be a little bit in the know that they do have some costs with some of those metrics. So just when you're creating dashboards around those, but it's a great option and availability to have those in there as well. Definitely suggest that. So this is an important section, right? This is going to help you decide your group sizing, right? If we leave a desired capacity 1, minimum 1, and max 1, all you're ever going to really have is kind of that one instance that's there. So it's important that we take a little bit of time to understand what your workload is going to look like so that we can decide, what capacity we want to have for desired, what's the minimum acceptable for our application to perform, and kind of where do we think our max capacity is. And max capacity is really just going to kind of help us keep costs under control. So we don't say spin up 5 instances under a where something will haywire and kind of keep it down. So for this demo, we've got 3, 3, and 5. If you decided you plan to have a little bit more workloads, so you know that you need a little bit more capacity, you could set this up and just change this to, let's say, 8 instances or something like that, and that would give us a little bit additional maximum capacity to go along with this. So basically what this is saying here is that our desired capacity is to be at 3 instances. We want our minimum capacity to always be at 3 instances, and then we want to be able to scale out to a max of 8. In order to get those to scale, though, this is another important section with our scaling policies. So scaling policies basically help us decide when we're going to actually add those instances to get to that maximum capacity. So if we don't define those, it's kind of it's not going to be the greatest experience for your auto scaling. So we're going to choose in this to enable our target tracking scaling policies and be able to manage that. So when we turn these on, basically you have a few different options. So we're just going to click into here and we'll see that we'll be able to have an average CPU utilization for one of them. We'll also be able to see our network in, network out, and if you tie this to an application load balancer in the end, you can see request counts per target. So for me, I know my application really, when it gets to CPU at a certain height, we'll say 80%, that's when I need to start worrying about scaling out additional instances, because anything 80%, it kind of starts to go slow, and I don't want my user bad experience, so I'm going to do that. That value is going to depend on your testing, right? So you're going to kind of have to test to see which you need, whether you're going to leverage it based on CPU utilization, whether you're going to know that with your network traffic, as it increases, that it's going to see latency and you're going to need to increase that. Depending also, that ties back to what instance size you're using for your throughput and such to kind of identify what size you should take. So a few different things you have to take into account there, but that should hopefully, give you a little bit of flexibility depending on CPU or network. Again, we've got target value here. We've got instance need warm-up time before they start including that metric. And then, of course, we can do a couple of different things like disable scale in to create only a scale out policy. There are some use cases where you would do this, but the nice part about auto scaling is that it will scale out as you need things, and then it will allow you to scale back in so that it can kind of help manage cost-wise for you, right? So leverage that, you're able to get the cost savings of it coming back down rather than always staying at your peak traffic load. So we're going to take additionally at this is scale in, and that just basically for instances that are newly scaled out. So we might not usually turn them on to the next. And this is another really nice feature to have availability of, and this is notifications. So this notification is going to send to SNS topics whenever an EC2 autoscaling launches, terminates, fails to launch. Basically, you can, if you don't have anything set up currently, set up a new SNS and paste the notification with easy notification. Then we're going to give it an email, say a distribution list that we set up for this, just to go to, say, our operations team. And then the event types that we want to track, we've got here that we can notify subscribers whenever instances launch, terminate, fail to launch, or fail to terminate. Now, these are all kind of important ones because obviously we want to know when an instance launched because that means that we're scaling up, right? So it's kind of a nice way to know that you have additional load going to your web servers or your application that you created. It's also nice to know that it actually launched and your auto-scaling group is working as intended. Additionally, things like terminate, you'd like to know when an instance terminates just to make the scale. You've got fail to launch, track additional items like if your instance failed to launch due to spot availability not being there, just to make sure that a subsequent launch did happen in, say, another availability zone. And then fail to terminate being another one as well, of course, because if it fails to terminate, you don't want to keep an instance out there that maybe doesn't need to be there and alleviate kind of the costs and such. So, Michael, is there any questions or anything you think of for kind of these notifications and such?
Hey, Rob, is there any way that you can, that's any recommendations on how you can integrate these into your automation? How you can, have these notifications to either do other actions or how they can be used for maybe other tools or purposes?
Yeah, I mean, so this is all based on simple notification service. So there's a lot of different things that you can kind of leverage with it, whether it be just simply sending an email. You could leverage this with, say, AWS chatbot to do some chatbot integration and such, and say, have these go to a Slack channel that you use. Since they're notifications, you can feed these into another pipeline, right, and send that notification in to perform another action. So if you got a, say, fail to launch, have it run a check just to make sure that you get that subsequent launch notification. Or if you use a service like ServiceNow or something that takes email ingestion for, say, ticket creation for your own internal tracking, so it's not, say, just going to an email box, you could leverage these kind of notifications for quite a few different things. So,
cool, thanks.
Great. So yeah, these are all really important kind of little additional items to have as far as those just kind of being aware of what's going on in your AWS environment. So try and make that easy to kind of integrate into there. Tagging, if you're not tagging things, they'll say start tagging everything that you possibly can in AWS. It will make your life easier in the long run. And the nice thing about auto scaling is that you can leverage these here within your auto scaling group for anything that basically spins up. You could give it a name. This might just be helpful for you to understand what that node is. So say we just call this ASG node, right? We know that this is now an auto scaling group node within our environment. And so now we can kind of take a look overall, and you could add a number of different tags, not just names. Say you wanted to give it, like production tags, so that as you have different things for, say, leveraging other services that can take a look at those tags to, say, conform to configured rules and such, you can leverage it with that. So that tagging is really great. It's also great for billing purposes as well. So if you want to keep better track of your cost management, you can tag things, and it'll help you kind of, do that. In review, though, of our configuration, see we've got all of our different instances that are defined here in our auto scaling group configuration. We can see that we've designated the first instance as one instance of on-demand. We've got 0% additional on-demand and 100% spot capacity available to us that we're using. Our allocation strategy for spot is leveraging this capacity optimize. And that's, like I said, going to help us to prevent interruptions in service by leveraging a vast pool of various instances. Here we can see that we've got T3 large, T3As, even T2s. As we were discussing before, you can throw in C, R, M, whatever other instance families you want to throw in there as well. And then we've got the different available networks that we're using as well. So we get those different pools that we can use. If we had load balancing enabled, we would see here load balancing in the target group. We're going to take a look at an existing auto scaling group that I have configured with load balancing there, because this is a really important part of load balancing or of using auto scaling is having that elastic load balancer in front of it so that you can distribute that traffic using that service. Here's where we would define our health checks that we're using EC2. any additional monitor settings, so if we enable the CloudWatch monitoring. Here's our capacity. So we're saying we want to have a desired capacity of always having 3 of those instances, minimum being 3 and our max being 8. And then we have additionally our scaling policy, basically just saying, this is where we're going to scale out based on 80% of my CPU. I know beyond that, I'm going to see some degradation in my performance. So let's get that scaling up. And then, like I mentioned before, our SNS topics that we can leverage these notifications, not only just for email notifications. If you're like me, you get a million emails a day, and sometimes you can get a little blind to that email noise. Leveraging the things like Michael was saying to integrate them into other services makes it really helpful to also leverage those notifications as well. So that pretty much gives us everything that's defined into our auto-scaling group. Including our tagging, right? Like I said, super important to have those tags. So definitely take a look at those. This one's just got a simple name, auto-scaling group, and here we click create. But since I already have an existing auto-scaling group created, we're not going to create that one. We're going to go take a look at the other side. Before we jump over to that, just checking in to see if there's any questions about anything we've covered so far in the auto-scaling group configuration or the launch templates.
No, we don't have any questions about the auto-scaling groups, the ASGs. We do have, there's a question for coming up and talking about instance termination notices, which I know you'll be covering soon. So we will be talking. We do have something on the board for that.
Yep, absolutely, and that's definitely, it's one of those important things with Spot to take advantage of. So we'll definitely cover that here in just a little bit. So we're just going to quickly take a look at an existing auto-scaling group that I already have defined. So we're going to cancel that. As we see, I have those 3 instances that it spun up and created previously. And I have this load balancer that's in front of it. Just get back to my actual auto-scaling group. There we go. And we have here kind of this predefined one. So very similar to the one that I showed that we were kind of creating. We've got a desired capacity of 3, minimum capacity 3. This one I've just got a max capacity of 5. And it's a kind of our setup where we have the same thing. We've got a launch template that's just specifying your AMI or AMI. Basic settings that we just bare bones need to get the instance kind of working. And then in my auto-scaling group, I've done the same thing here where I've specified one on-demand instance. And that's optional, right? So if you wanted to do 100% Spot, you could, and just use the percentage above and beyond. I like to always have one. I recommend just kind of having one there as a best practice so that you have that base to start with, just in case for some odd reason you run into an area where you maybe didn't have Spot capacity there. You just make sure you have that one on-demand always running in your environment. So our maximum Spot price, you can see, is just capped at on-demand price. This is another thing with this side that you don't have to worry about. We saw in the launch configuration, right? You had to kind of bid on what you wanted to have for your pricing there. The launch templates, we really don't have that built in. It just basically says we're going to give you as much discount as we can based on the capacity up into paying at most on-demand pricing, so you don't have to go above that on-demand price. Same thing here where I specify basically just an assortment of T3, T3As as well. So since it's a basic web application that I have, it's not processor dependent, so I can use a mixture of Intel and AMD and I won't see any issues. I've spread this across the same availability zones, so I can leverage all those Spot capacity pools between those 5 availability zones. Now this one I do have tied to a load balancer. And we can see here that I have this notice as a load balancer target groups, and I have this KCL TG. We're just going to take a quick look here. So if you're not familiar with our elastic load balancers, we have within our network load balancers and our application load balancers something called a target group. And that allows you to basically group instances together that will get similar traffic. Leveraging this with auto scaling is really great because instead of you having to manage what instances are going to go in there, once you tie a target group in with auto scaling, when an instance spins up in that auto scaling, it will automatically get added to this target group. And that will allow you to then leverage those instances behind that load balancer. So as I mentioned, I already have a load balancer created. I've got this KCL target group. I've got a couple of them kind of defined that I could add these to. Within here, if I didn't though, I could create a load balancer or create a target group. And this would give us those kind of different options to do those things here. So if you haven't played with Elastic Load Balancing, it's really a great key feature to leverage with these auto scaling. So definitely take a look at that. And it will help you to be able to bounce traffic across these instances that your auto scaling group is kind of building out and spinning up for you. So we'll kind of move on from here and from these different load balancer options and such, and we'll go into kind of looking at what that overall setup looks like, basically with these. So we can see I've got this auto scaling group, and this load balancer is tied to that. And so this is the actual load balancer. And to set this up with that, you basically have listeners, and those listeners then can forward things to various different things. So this is an application load balancer, so it supports advanced routing features. Really all I'm doing in this one is forwarding it to a specific target group. So I just have this KCL TG that we defined here previously, right? And then we're just going to look to see that within that KCL TG, we have a few different instances that are configured to just kind of be in there. So let's get this to load here in a second. It's just taking a little bit to load for some reason. But once that comes up, we'll be able to see kind of the instances that are tied into that and see that. So let's just switch tabs here. Maybe it's just not open right. There we go. Let's pop that up. Maybe it's loading. All right, so here's what it looks like for our target group. Basically, all we're saying is that it's got instances that are behind it by this target type. We've got port 80 that's listing. It's in a certain VPC, and that's the VPC where we chose all those 5 different availability zones with the subnets. We're just listing on HTTP. We've got different health checks and stuff set up for these so that our load balancer works. And targets is where we're really going to look at to be able to see those instances. So I have the single on-demand instance that's in there, and then I also have these other auto-scaling group instances that are just going to get added to this as they scale up and scale down. Since I have these 3 different instances here, my website is available even if I lose one of these, and we can leverage this to kind of make sure that we always have that availability. So I've got my website here, and it's just kind of sitting behind that load balancer. And if I were to come in and say terminate one of these instances, because why not? Get a little warning that says I'm going to terminate those. Goes from running, and we'll do a refresh. And we'll see I have a filter for anything running. So that will disappear because it's no longer a running instance, but I can still go to my website and it still continues to be there. I can refresh all day and it won't have any issues. So that's kind of the nice flexibility and availability to having these multiple instances. Depending on your web application, and we're going to cover, like I said before, a little bit onto basically how to handle those and take care of all that information and such. But as we can see, we can keep track of activity here on what's scaled up or what's scaled out. So since I terminated one, it says, hey, this is terminated in response, and now I'm going to launch a new EC2 instance. And you can see before that I terminated that instance, right? It went from running to not running. And it says here that because it saw that there's a capacity of 2, we need to scale out to make it back to our desired capacity of 3. And so that's where we're going to make sure that we have that kind of setting. Just checking in, make sure, Michael, there's no other questions or anything like that so far on how this is kind of tied into the application load balancer or how the auto-scaling group's configured.
No, I put a comment in the chat talking about we're talking at these things at really high level.
Yes.
This is really kind of like a 200 level, 100, 200 level run through, but you can enable some really advanced use cases and functionality. One of the things I was going to point out, right, is, for example, the target type. There you're showing that you have a number of instances that are there, but a target type could be an IP address, or it could even be a Lambda function.
Right, yeah. With the application load balancer, there's a lot of, as mentioned with the advanced routing features, you can route to different services like to Fargate, to Lambda, to EC2 instances, to IP, so you could even route to traffic that existed in your own data center by IP address if you had like a direct connect set up to it. So there's definitely a lot that you could do to integrate these different things in there. even with just the auto scaling group configuration, there's different things you can do as far as you could do scheduled scaling policies and such with it. So there is definitely a lot you can play with auto scaling. And towards the end, we're going to show some or share some different kind of workshops and such you can use as well to kind of go a little bit deeper into this and get some hands-on experience with it. So definitely a great call out, because there is a lot more that we could go in depth. We would be here for quite a bit more.
All right, Rob, thanks.
Yeah. So here we just kind of see our scaling policy, right? We're doing by that target tracking. We can see that even though I terminated an instance, it's already scaled up and put in service a new instance for me, so that I'm at my minimum capacity of 3. And yeah, that kind of shows us just kind of everything that we've got set up here for our auto scaling group. So with that being said, that's kind of what we have as far as just a demo of showing how that works and how you can leverage it to make sure that you have a highly available web application, or that you can leverage auto scaling with not only web applications, but say for other services that you're using as well. This was kind of fun, but just focusing on like I said, about a 100 level, 200 level kind of intro and a way to assimilate and use auto scaling with your Elastic Cloud Compute with Spot in order to keep savings and leverage everything there. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second and switch back over. I've just got a few slides that we're going to jump back over to, just to kind of, reiterate some of the different items that we've covered so far today. So we looked at kind of combining all of these single, auto scaling group from our previous model where you had to manage the individual ones. So with that, we can see here, right? These instances are requested across different availability zones. They've got different purchase options and instance types. And this just helps you stay really flexible and really take advantage of the elasticity of the cloud. So when you deploy things, you can leverage those different T3, Cs, Rs, Ms, whatever into the auto scaling group here. As we can see, we've got a mixture of things like C4, M5 large, M4 large, and really leverage all those different things together. Further iterate on the different options, and we'll include a link as well to kind of choosing the spot instance request, whether you want to go with the lowest price that we kind of mentioned real briefly before on, if you're really just trying to drive costs down, you can allow the auto scaling group to choose lowest price, and that will select instances in AZs at the least cost on those spot instances. You can diversify, just define a mixed instances and different purchase models with these. And then we kind of focused mainly on today was our capacity optimized, right? And this helps us to minimize interruptions. And that's like what we're going to use it for as our primary goal. So something that's maybe running in production that you're like, I need to make sure that, one, I'm keeping costs down. So I'm going to use my different options of RIs and saving plans for that base. But I'm also going to leverage Spot. But I can't afford to have too much interruption with that. So that's where we might leverage that capacity optimized kind of option there. So just kind of, reiterate on the things we covered in the demo. Those are kind of the different options. To the very important part, dealing with spot interruptions, right? So spot instances, they're very reliable. They do last for a decent amount of time, but inevitably they're excess capacity and there is a potential for this. So you do want to make sure that you kind of plan for these spot interruptions, and we send a notification out. You'll get a notification 2 minutes before we're basically going to reclaim that spot instance. And this comes to you in the form of basically a CloudWatch event. And that way you have a couple different ways to kind of monitor and check for that. And based on these, say using EventBridge and a CloudWatch event, you could see this event come in and use some sort of automation. This is going to depend on how your application works and how you really want it to interact with. But really to leverage these things with, say, that load balancer to say, hey, this is a spot instance. I know you see this as healthy right now, load balancer, but it's not going to be healthy in 2 minutes. So at this point, go ahead and start doing some connection draining and let that kind of bleed off so you have a graceful transition. Alternatively, if you have an application that's running on the instance and you want it to do something, say you have state that you need to transfer, or you need to make sure that something graceful or changes within the application before it actually gets shut down. Within your application, you can leverage the instance metadata service, and that will use IMS to basically be able to query and see that there's a state of this coming into termination in 2 minutes and trigger your application to kind of do something there to help you kind of make sure you get around that. Are there any questions, I guess, just before we get moving forward here? and start to kind of wrap up things on our kind of spot interruption or anything on the auto scaling groups, Mike?
Hopefully we answered Hithering's question there in regards to handling spot interruption notifications. If not, please feel free to call out. We'll be happy to respond to that if we can in the time we've got. But no, we're looking good. Take us home here, Rob.
All right, great. So yeah, definitely take a look at some time into the spot interruption notifications. We're also including a blog article we've got on how to kind of demo this out. So if you want to test this on your own account to kind of see what it looks like and go from there. So just to kind of reiterate, right, spot instances, they're used widely. Just kind of one basic workload example we looked at today was web services, right? Using EC2 auto scaling, even using Amazon EC2 Fleet, we can be able to scale based on throughput. You can get deep cost savings on large scale web applications. So as we saw here, this was 3 and 8, little instances that you could use. And that's my size of operation. We've got different customers that are using this on a greater scale for their spot compute usage. You can leverage these different things to include spot with your RIs and on-demand purchases in a single auto-scaling group. You can scale based on that spot capacity, leveraging pricing as well. So we mentioned the different models that we have for low price and such and everything. And just to kind of further emphasize a little bit, this is just a little bit of an example of the different industries and verticals that use spot. So as you can see, it's a very wide range of different companies that are able to leverage this in their infrastructure. So if you haven't taken the chance to actually play with spot compute and leverage it with auto scaling, it's really great workload usage for even additional services like using it with our Elastic Kubernetes services or Elastic MapReduce, which is where some of these kind of get adopted into. So other than that, I think that concludes everything that we've got. So I just want to say thank you everyone for joining. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email us at kc-live@amazon.com. But if you have any other questions right now, we've got just a couple of minutes.
Yeah, Rob, so in the chat, I dropped some links there for the EC2 spot workshops that people can go and do on their own and follow along, build up that familiarity and that comfort with all this topics and a lot of this stuff that you've covered here today. So thanks,
Yes.
Really appreciate it, Rob.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Yes, definitely take a look at those workshops. They are great for getting that hands-on kind of guided workflow through those things. So, all right. Well, thank you, everyone, for your time. And hope we see you next time on our next episode.
Bye.